You are watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Ali Abunimah. We're going to turn now to our next guest, Dr. Ben Thomson. Ben has been volunteering in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip since 2013. He recently returned from Gaza. He worked as a medic during the Great March of Return in 2018 when Israel deployed snipers to murder and maim thousands of unarmed civilians protesting the siege of Gaza and demanding their right to return home. He's also taught annually at the Islamic University of Gaza, now destroyed by Israeli bombing, but he helped develop multiple medical education programs there. And he was suspended from his job in Toronto last October after calling out a Canadian Israel lobby group for dehumanizing and inaccurate comments about Palestinians. Dr. Ben Thomson, thank you so much for spending time with us on the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm really humbled to be on immediately after the brilliant historian, Dr. Pape. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Where do we even begin? Talk about your most recent trip to Gaza. As I said, you've been going to Palestine over the last 10 years. What was different this time, and what were you doing there now?
Yeah, so Nora, I've been, like you mentioned, I've been going since 2013, but I was actually there in September 2023. So I had a really good sense of what was happening immediately before October. And of course, having read the news, as all of us have, having lost friends, loved ones in Gaza over the last several months, and myself being a humanitarian, I've extensively studied the situation on the ground and heard daily from my friends and humanitarian aid workers who were there. So I expected to see a humanitarian emergency. I expected to see a humanitarian disaster. I had read about genocide. I had not seen it with my eyes before. Certainly, I've been to Gaza during bombings before, but this was something completely different. It was beyond my worst expectations, and despite the horror that I saw, I'm actually quite hopeful that at some point Gaza will develop a healthcare system by Palestinians for Palestinians, because every day I was there, I met another amazing physician or an amazing patient who, despite everything that they've suffered, is just showing outstanding resilience.
And you're a specialist, you're a nephrologist.
And a kidney doctor.
Yeah, kidney doctor, right?
That's right. That's right.
I mean, what is it like? I mean, just the logistics of specialty care at this time. You know, how are you able to diagnose, let alone treat chronic illnesses or diseases at a time when specialists are being murdered, equipment is being destroyed, and basic diagnostic tools and equipment are simply unavailable?
You know, I think of one girl that I saw in Gaza. As a kidney doctor, I don't usually see children. Most of my practice in Canada is only with adults. But given the very limited access to subspecialty care that predated October in Gaza, that's been a problem that's been a long time. You know, just as an example, prior to October 2023, there were 2 board-certified kidney doctors to manage over 2 million people in Gaza. Just to give you a comparison, in a city like Toronto or a Canadian or North American center with a similar population, you would expect to have about 20 to 30 subspecialists for that population. So they already had a fraction of what was needed. And Dr. Hammam Allo, a very young but incredibly talented nephrologist, was killed in his house with his father and father-in-law. The head of internal medicine, who also himself did some subspecialty nephrology or kidney medicine care, Dr. Rafat Labad, he was killed. And one of the other doctors who was doing kidney care, Dr. Abdullah, who was in fact running the Shifa hospital. The Shifa hospital, of course, has been bombed, and we've all seen what's happened to the Shifa hospital over the last few days. They simply can't provide care, either because they themselves have been killed or the resources to provide care don't exist. And if I go to that 18-month-old girl that I saw, it's quite a revealing case. You know, Reem came in with her mom in one of the primary care clinics that I was working in just about a week ago in Rafah. And I was able to establish that her spleen and her liver were both much larger than I would have expected. I could feel lymph nodes. There really wasn't blood work available, but the very, very limited blood work that we had access to suggested that she probably had cancer. And we were worried that she probably had lymphoma. Now, typically we diagnose that by doing a biopsy and to sending it to a specialist doctor who would look at it under a microscope and establish the diagnosis. We would typically do that after doing a CAT scan or an MRI or some type of imaging to identify, whether this cancer had spread, for example. Unfortunately, prior to October, there were 3 MRI machines in Gaza. All of those have been bombed or destroyed and are no longer functional. Of the 5 CT scanners that were present in September 2023, 4 have been destroyed, and one of them is awaiting a part to be delivered once Israel provides permission for that to be delivered. So we can't do imaging. It also happens that the lab that would read a biopsy has also been bombed. So they basically can't read biopsies. And the 2 pathologists that would read that biopsy, even if we have a lab, both of them have been killed. So there is essentially no mechanism to diagnose cancer in a way that we could start treatment for this 18-month-old girl. Even if we could diagnose it, in September, where did children with cancer get treatment? At Rantisi Hospital in Gaza City. Well, that's been bombed. So there's literally no capacity to provide this 18-month-old girl care. And so we had no choice but to demand through initially the WHO that approved it. And then subsequently, the second step is to get approval from Israel to leave Gaza. And to leave Gaza for perhaps going to Jordan or Qatar or some other location that might be able to provide this young girl care. Unfortunately, only 1 in 2 of the requests for leaving Gaza are approved for females, and it's about 1 in 3 for males. So you can see there's a huge amount of morbidity and death related to the destruction of the healthcare system. And, traditionally, when we think about the over 30,000 people who have been killed in Gaza, we traditionally think about it as far as bombs, explosions. That's the typical way we think about it. But we forget about the fact that people like Reem, young children like Reem, who have these new diagnoses that are completely survivable if they were in a healthcare system from September 2023 that hadn't been completely targeted and decimated, we forget that she's also a casualty of this genocide.
And this is on top of 17 years of a blockade that has now been effectively normalized. Like, I just hearing that there was, 1 MRI machine for 2.3 million people, that has been normalized. And I mean, what capacity did specialists like yourself have in Gaza during this, this 17 years of blockade until October? And how do you see it? I mean, just, it's just kind of unfathomable to think that those were the good old days now in terms of medical care.
It's a really good question. So in 2013, I did my first visit in Gaza, and at that time, I was doing a needs assessment for internal medicine and kidney medicine. So I visited most of the health facilities throughout Gaza at that time. And at the end, I had to create a report that was provided to the health authorities, essentially so they could target investment to determine how best to improve those programs. Now, the very first recommendation that was suggested by the team of doctors that did this assessment was that if the occupation and siege didn't exist, there would have been no need to do the assessment in the first place. And I think that's so true of so many of the interventions that take place in Gaza. So many of the NGOs are there doing work that would be completely unnecessary if the Palestinians were given the freedom without a legal occupation to create their own health systems. You've mentioned the topic of subspecialist physicians, and it's a really important topic. One of the things that I identified on that first visit is that you have over 2 million people and one cardiologist, one heart doctor. You have, at that time, one kidney doctor. And that's impossible. Like, that's simply impossible to provide adequate care. And why does that exist? Well, it exists because those very determined, heroic physicians in Gaza, they want to learn. They want to develop their own programs to teach other physicians. But part of that requires them to leave Gaza and to go to international centers of training. And overwhelmingly, they have almost no opportunities to do that. And oftentimes their applications to do so are rejected by Israel. So instead, they rely heavily on international groups coming in and doing that training. But you can imagine how difficult that is, because often those applications are also rejected. So, I initiated a charity in 2013 that was focused specifically on enhancing medical education in the occupied territories of Palestine, which include, of course, West Bank and Gaza. And we've had significant challenges. The overwhelming majority of the people we've trained have been in West Bank, simply because it's almost impossible to get in and out of Gaza. And that problem won't change unless the occupation is abolished.
Yeah. Ben, you were as you've told us, you were just in Gaza. Describe to us a day in Gaza, just what you wake up to, what you see, what's it like around you? What's it like trying to work and to heal people in this situation? And talk about where you were exactly in Gaza, if you can.
Absolutely. So I was part of a group that was evaluating non-communicable diseases. So this means things like diabetes, blood pressure, cancer care, dialysis care. And as part of that evaluation, I was located predominantly in the southern part of Gaza, in Rafah and Khan Yunis. We did do a site visit as well to Al-Aqsa Hospital, which is at that point was the hospital the farthest north that we were permitted to go, admittedly with quite heightened security protocols to do so. The average day of most people in Gaza is 24-hour, around-the-clock drones. So every moment of the day, you hear the drones above. Every night, your sleep is interrupted by explosions. I didn't get one night where I wasn't woken up by bombings. And that's a way of life now for everyone, for the majority of people in Gaza who are now in the south. In addition to that, I think it should be stated that the majority of people in Gaza have access to such limited water that it's under 20% of what would be considered the international standard of 15 liters. Most people now have less than 3 liters a day. And the people who are living in the tent cities in Rafah, they have one toilet for every 800 to 1,000 people, limited access to water. They're lucky to get one meal a day, and oftentimes get no meals a day. When we went in,
we actually have some pictures you shared with us. I don't know if you can see that, but feel free to talk about some of these pictures and what they show.
Yeah, so the picture you're seeing there is in the Mawazi tent city camp. And what you see there is essentially a block. It looks like a block of cement, but it's actually a toilet. There's a hole in the middle. And that serves about 800 to 1,000 people. There's one of those blocks for about every 800 people. You can also see that there's no door, so there's absolutely no privacy, and there's no lights. So what we found when we visited this tent city was that while people were using this at night, you can imagine that's not accessible to people with physical disabilities. It's not safe for people to use at night because they simply can't see. There's no privacy or dignity with using it. So what had materialized is that a lot of the people living in that area were able to walk down to the beach, despite the fact that raw sewage is now being left to drain directly into the ocean, people are using the ocean to bathe. That has dramatically increased the risk of diarrheal illness and skin infections. There isn't access to water except for water trucks, which is limited to about 2 to 3 liters a day, which people have to use for everything. Food preparation, bathing, cleaning their clothes, everything. It's simply not enough. So people are barely living, they're barely surviving. Limited food, limited water, no hygiene. It's an absolute disgrace to humanity that this is allowed to happen, because the entire world has known about this for months and months and months. What you see here in this pictures is a number of tents that have been built immediately adjacent to the Israeli border. And children who live in this area will often walk up to the fence and try talking to the Egyptian guards. And this is
next to the Egyptian border.
Correct. This one is immediately adjacent to the Rafah border. In response to this, and under the concern that some people from Gaza would escape, so to speak, to Egypt, since October has reinstituted a second set of fences immediately after this set of fences that you can see in this photograph here. Again, further disconnecting Gaza from the rest of the world. And so what you see here in this photograph, this is a photograph in the Rafah area where there are massive numbers of tents. We talked about the lack of sanitation and hygiene, the very high rates of infectious diseases. What you see here is a graveyard. And so previously there were 3 graveyards in Rafah, but the massive death toll of over 30,000 people, there simply wasn't anywhere left to bury them. Initially, this was confronted by trying to dig up some of the graves in which family members could also be buried in with people who were already buried in the Rafah cemeteries, but that became impossible to continue. Subsequently, this cemetery was built immediately adjacent to some of the tent cities. And what you'll see here is only approximately about 1/3 of the entire size of the cemetery. Sadly, they don't have enough space to bury one person per grave, so they're often burying 3 or 4 family members in the same grave. It's absolutely horrendous. One of the doctors that I know quite well from my previous trips, he used to run a hospital that has actually been bombed in Gaza City. He subsequently moved to Rafah, where he now resides. 3 of his 4 children were killed in an airstrike before he moved south, and they're buried in this graveyard. His wife is also buried in this graveyard in another part of the graveyard, separate from his 3 children. And so people are living amongst this unlivable conditions immediately adjacent to those very people, their loved ones who have been killed. This picture is especially difficult for me because what you see here are they've run out of grave stones. And so what they're using instead is cinder blocks. And the cinder blocks you see there, the smaller ones, I was told, were for children. And you can see here there's a massive number of small cinder blocks representing 1 and often more children who are buried together from the same family. And you can see in the background, this graveyard is immediately adjacent to a very densely populated tent city. This is how people in Gaza are living. They are literally living amongst the dead. And they themselves in conditions which are not compatible with life. It's, as a humanitarian, I've studied the humanitarian principles, right? These are things that are part of our religion, so to speak. We know about humanity, neutrality, impartiality, independence. These are our guiding principles. And, as a humanitarian, I'm appalled that what we see here is inhumane. And I find it impossible to be neutral in a situation where literally what we're seeing is genocide. We see here as well in this photograph, this picture was also taken in Rafah, and what you see is a food tent, and you see hundreds of people lining up for the food tent. This is just beside the tent city that I showed you, also in Rafah. There's really two reasons why people line up for anything in Gaza right now. One is for food, and one is at banks, where government workers hope that the bank opens and provide them whatever small fraction of salary they're entitled to so that they can support their families. Here is a lineup for food. And if the people in this lineup are lucky, they'll all get one meal on that particular day. Many of them will go home with no food. In the city area outside of this photograph, we commonly saw children walking with empty pots, banging the pots, hoping to find food, hoping to find someone who would bring them food, and often, not eating at all. Children in this area were almost all barefoot. We saw in one of the wound clinics hundreds of wounds related to mass displacement, people moving from the north to the south. One case particular is very, memorable to me. Was it was actually a doctor, a very heroic doctor, who she and her family had been living in northern Gaza. She's a student at the same university I teach at, Islamic University of Gaza. And her family had been displaced not once, not twice, not even 3 times, but 4 times, each time moving from one tent to another tent. And by the time she had her 4th displacement event, she ended up living in a UN shelter in Rafah with her family. Now, her medical school career is completely uncertain. The medical school, both Al-Azhar University and Islamic University, have been bombed, and there is no university courses at the moment. She's only midway through her medical school, so it's completely uncertain what will happen with her medical studies. But as soon as she arrived in Rafah, she went to a clinic where she's now volunteering full-time in one of the wound clinics there, completely unpaid. And each time I worked with her after clinic, she would ask me to stay to teach her, because she's had essentially no medical school classes. So I would stay for an hour to provide her with some extra teaching. And this to me is heroic. I remember asking her, the question that we all should stop asking in this genocide is, how are you? I've as a Canadian, it's almost ingrained in my DNA. It's our national greeting. But, I asked her this question, and her answer was, I'm alive. My family is with me. All of us are alive. And for that reason, in Gaza, we're very, very lucky. But the fact that she continues to work, she is smiling. She never stops smiling. She's more concerned about her patients. That to me is the story of the Gaza physicians who are heroes, who are still working, the overwhelming majority of whom are unpaid, the overwhelming majority of whom have been displaced and are now working often in unbearable conditions with limited access to medications, limited access to supplies. They're doing an amazing job with the limited resources they have. Those to me are absolutely heroic people.
Yeah. Ben, you also have photos and video that you took of the aid trucks that are just permanently, it seems, blocked by Israel, supported by the US, at the crossings. Can you explain what's going on in this video?
Yeah, so the only mechanism now with which non-government organizations or charities enter Gaza is through the southern border, through Rafah. And
which is a pedestrian crossing. It's not meant for
exactly.
industrial commercial trucks, right?
Exactly. And because there's multiple border crossings that Israel could open. We're familiar with, for example, Kerem Sharam crossing, which typically would be used to bring in trucks. There's also some crossings in northern Gaza, in northern Gaza that would normally open to facilitate aid. These have been by and large closed. And Karam Sharam crossing, we've all seen, for example, the Israeli civilians who in fact blocked aid at that site. So really aid has been limited to Rafah border crossing. This video is on the drive into Rafah through the Sinai Peninsula. There's literally miles and miles and miles of aid trucks that are stopped. And, the delegation of healthcare workers that I came in with included physicians that had been there just 3 weeks prior, and they recognized many of these aid trucks as the same aid trucks that had been there 3 weeks ago. They're not moving. And so, as much as I am delighted that there are attempts to bring aid in non-traditional ways, airdrops are not the way to overcome a famine. They are not sufficient.
And Ben, as we've been saying all along, I mean, these videos, and we are very grateful to you for sharing them with us, because they corroborate what we've been saying, and the other reports have been saying. There have also been satellite images showing thousands of trucks lined up, that this famine, this starvation is deliberate, it is engineered, Absolutely. It is on purpose. And so, all the airdrops and the efforts, we're going to talk more about the so-called maritime corridor with John coming up. This is all a distraction. This is all to send out the message to people that, oh, look, we're doing everything we can. And it's just PR stunts. The reality is, if the United States and Israel, the two principal powers here, wanted to let those trucks in through Rafah, they would come in, or through Kerem Shalom, or through any of the other crossings. It's in their hands, but they've made a decision not to allow the aid in, and instead to distract people with these airdrops, which if anything are harmful, because the reports I mean, aside from the fact that these things are literally falling on people's heads and killing people, or falling in the sea, or some have fallen in Israel, they're also falling into a situation where there's no orderly distribution, and it opens people up to being vulnerable to unscrupulous or desperate people who are hoarding the aid or selling it for very high prices and so on. So it's just crucial that you showed us those videos.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the airdrops are largely performative to demonstrate a supposed desire to confront a famine, but they're ineffective and essentially harmful. Knowing what was contained on those aid trucks, if they were allowed in, that's the mechanism. There have been a number of famine reviews published recently, including one as early as last week. And the reviews still say that this famine can be confronted with aid, meaning we can overcome it with aid. So they're still hopeful that, those trucks, if they're let in, we could confront the famine. But those famine reviews do not have a role in airdrops. They're pretty deliberate to say that, if you're going to let 37 trucks in a day and suggest that that's going to overcome this genocide, when we had about 500 trucks coming in per day in September 2023, that's a joke. That's completely inadequate. And I fully agree with your description, Ali. It is fully performative.
Finally, Dr. Ben Thomson, I'll ask you the same question that we asked Ilan Pape. What gives you hope right now, and what should people outside of Palestine who are watching this with horror, inside and outside the medical community, what should people be doing right now?
Yeah, I guess I'll answer the second question first. You know what to do, and if you are someone that can go to Gaza and provide on the ground aid as part of one of the emergency medical teams, I recommend you do so. There are inadequate physicians on the ground, or inadequate numbers of physicians on the ground now. The people that are there now working in healthcare are absolutely incredible, but there's just not enough of them. So if you can do that. I also think it's critical, if you're not in the healthcare profession, you need to be calling your members of parliament. You need to be out protesting. You need to be supporting the boycott, divest, and sanction movement. These things are meaningful. They're impactful, and people in Gaza rely on our efforts to push our own governments to make the changes on the ground that matter. So I do think those things matter. With regards to what gives me hope, to be honest, it's the people in Gaza. When you consider the over 70 years of suffering, of the decades of occupation, of not being able to have a right to self-determination, not being able to build their own healthcare system. And yet, despite that, what I saw in September and what I saw again in March are people operating with absolute heroism, working for free for 20 hours a day, living in a tent as healthcare professionals, saving lives, doing the best they can. And so even though I saw some absolutely horrendous things that were absolutely inhumane and easily preventable, even though I saw that, I also saw, people in Gaza, what they want is peace. What they want is an end to the illegal occupation. They want freedom. They want the ability for their kids to grow up in a place that has some degree of certainty. And that's what they deserve.
Indeed. Dr. Ben Thomson, you are a nephrologist, specialist, humanitarian educator. People can go to your social media on Twitter at twitter.com/BenNephrology. Thank you so much for your incredible work and for being with us on the Electronic Intifada live stream. We'd love to have you back on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ben Thomson, and I hope that people will heed your call.
Yeah.
And thank you for everything you shared with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.